Oops. Okay, good morning. Uh, Today we are going to start talking about the second major half or portion of the cardiovascular system, and that is, of course, the blood. All right, the heart and the blood vessels would be pretty much useless unless we actually had, whoopsie daisy, blood to be pushed through them. All right, the heart is the pump, the blood vessels are the pipes, and the blood is the fluid that actually travels through them. Now, um, you may or may not be aware of the fact that the human body contains somewhere between 4.5 and 5.5 on average liters of blood. And your heart is capable of pushing 5 liters or so throughout your body every single minute, which means that your heart recycles your entire blood supply every minute, every 60 seconds or so. All right, so that's a pretty efficient little pump. All right, now, what does the blood actually do for you? Well, in our discussion of the heart and the blood vessels, we kind of already talked about this first point here, which was the transportation bit. All right, and of course, the four major things that need to be delivered to and taken from your body cells are oxygen, nutrients, wastes, and carbon dioxide. But you should be aware that there are many other things that travel through your blood as well, proteins and other things. All right, and one of the most important is hormones. Now, we're not going to talk about hormones today specifically, but we will get to them when we talk about the endocrine system um, in a week or two. Now, another major function of your blood is defense, all right? And we don't usually think about that as the function of blood, but it is, all right? The white blood cells defend us against pathogens, things like bacteria and viruses and other things that can make us sick. And then finally, the blood has regulatory functions. We've already talked about the idea that your blood helps to regulate your blood temperature, or your body temperature. But it also is responsible for maintaining the water-salt balance in your body, as well as the pH of the body. And we'll get to all of these things over the course of the next couple of videos. Now, before we begin, it's important to remember that blood is a fluid connective tissue. So it's designed to kind of hold the body together. And it's got two major components. The first are the formed elements. These are cells or parts of cells that actually perform a very specific task within the body. And all of the formed elements are formed in what we call the red bone marrow. All right, the red bone marrow. And we'll talk about that some more when we get to the skeletal system. All right, but inside of your bones. Now, the three formed elements are the red blood cells, which in Greek is erythrocytes, which literally means red cells. And sometimes you'll see them abbreviated as RBC, red blood cell. The second are the white blood cells, sometimes called leukocytes, and these are referred to as WBCs in your textbook and elsewhere. WBC is white blood cell. And the third and final formed elements are the platelets. Now, we'll talk about each of their functions in just a few moments. The second major component of blood is the plasma, and this is the matrix of blood. All right, the ground substance in the matrix, and it is composed of 92% water. So when somebody says that you're made up mostly water, there's a good argument there. All right, 92% of your blood is actually water, or at least of your blood plasma is water. The other 8% are salts and organic molecules that are dissolved in the water. And the most abundant of these are the plasma proteins. There are gazillion types of plasma proteins, but the three most important are the albumins, which are helpful in osmosis and diffusion, globulins, which help in transport, and then finally fibrinogen, which is important in clotting. All right, and again, we'll talk about each of these as we go through. All right, but water and plasma proteins. Now, let's specifically start with the formed elements and talk about the structure of red blood cells. All right. Interestingly enough, red blood cells are very small and they lack a nucleus and have very few organelles, meaning that they're not carrying out most of the life processes that your average American cell would be carrying out. They have a very specific job, and that job is to transport oxygen from the lungs to each of the body's cells. Now, each of the red blood cells contains about 280 million hemoglobin molecules. And the hemoglobin molecule is shown on the right-hand side of the picture here. Remember, it's composed of 4 peptides to make up the hemoglobin protein. And there's 280 million of these on every single red blood cell. All right. And each hemoglobin can bind 3 molecules of oxygen. So that's a lot of oxygen moving around in your body at any given time. Now, red blood cells themselves have what we call a biconcave shape. It's like somebody took a hockey puck and just kind of squeezed it in the middle. And what this does is it increases the surface area. Remember that list of important things: diffusion, surface area, and so on. All right, these terms are going to come up again and again throughout this course. So the biconcave shape increases the surface area, which allows each red blood cell to carry more hemoglobin molecules, which allows it to carry more oxygen molecules. Now, in terms of red blood cells, where are they produced? Well, as you already know, red blood cells are produced in the red bone marrow. So your skeleton is actually the site of the factory for red blood cells. Red blood cells themselves have a lifespan of about 120 days before they wear out and are then destroyed either in the liver or in the spleen. Now, if for whatever reason you are out of homeostasis, all right, and you don't have enough oxygen in your blood, all right, you're anemic for some reason, then interestingly enough, your kidneys will produce a hormone called erythropoietin, which is symbolized as EPO, or abbreviated, I should say, as EPO. And so the kidneys secrete EPO, and the EPO is carried by the blood to the red bone marrow. And what it does there is it stimulates the production of more red blood cells. More red blood cells means more hemoglobin. More hemoglobin means more oxygen. And so then the oxygen level goes back up. This is a wonderful example of negative feedback, all right? Just again, to go back to that list of important things, right? The stimulus is a low oxygen level in the blood, all right? The response, make more or carry more oxygen in the blood. And it's a several step process, right? You go through the kidneys, the bone marrow, and so on. But still, the end result is a reduction in the stimulus. The stimulus is a low blood oxygen level. The response is to raise the blood oxygen level. Okay. EPO, by the way, is a hormone that is banned in many professional sports because it can synthetic versions of it can be introduced into the body and allow you to carry oxygen more efficiently. Lance Armstrong, who won the Tour de France like 100 years in a row, was actually stripped of his titles because he was doping with EPO, a synthetic form of EPO. Okay. Now, as always, whenever we talk about a system, we're going to talk about things that can go wrong with that system. And there are certain disorders that involve red blood cells. On this list, I've included anemia, which is a condition that results from either having too few red blood cells or too little hemoglobin on those red blood cells, and it causes a fatigued feeling. You're tired all the time. And if you think about it, that makes sense, because if your cells aren't getting enough oxygen, your muscles especially are going to be tired. They're going to be not getting what they need to act as efficiently as they can. Sickle cell anemia is a genetic disorder, and it causes your red blood cells to have a very atypical shape, a sickle shape, and they tend to rupture. They tend to not be able to carry as much oxygen, and so people with sickle cell anemia are often fatigued, but they also tend to clot, and especially in joints in the body. They kind of bunch up and run into traffic jams, and this can cause joint pain, severe joint pains. Finally, hemolytic disease of the newborn. This is a condition where if mom has one blood type and a baby has a different blood type, it it can cause an immune response, which can lead to all sorts of issues. We're going to talk about hemolytic disease in much greater detail at the end of the second of the two videos on blood. Now, the second formed element are the white blood cells. These are also derived from the red bone marrow. Now that seems weird, right? Red blood cells are in the red bone marrow, but white blood cells are also in the red bone marrow, all right, or formed there. All right, there is no white bone marrow. Now, white blood cells are very large blood cells that do have a nucleus. All right. Their production is regulated by a hormone called CSF, or colony stimulating factor. And they can be found in your blood, but they can also be found moving around inside your body tissues. And essentially what they're doing there is they're looking for things that don't belong, items that are not part of you, things like viruses, bacteria, prions, and so on. All right. And their job is to fight infections. All right. And so they are a huge part of our immune systems. Now, some white blood cells live for days. All right. But others, and those are the ones that are fighting off the bacteria and the pathogens. But others can live for years. And these are the memory cells that essentially confer immunity on you. Right. Once you've had a certain disease, it is very unlikely that you're going to get that same disease again. Because you're immune. Now, white blood cells have the ability to change their shape and literally squeeze out of the bloodstream through the capillaries. I love this picture because it illustrates just how small a capillary is. Notice, come on. Notice this one is composed of two cells here, one on the left, one on the right. And this white blood cell is literally squeezing right through the boundary between the two capillary cells. They're going out into, this down here represents connective tissues. And so the white blood cells are going out into the connective tissue and looking for things that don't belong there, like viruses and pathogens of any type. Disorders of white blood cells can be very severe because, obviously if your defense mechanisms are down, you're going to be susceptible to a lot of diseases. And so SCID, or severe combined immunodeficiency disease, is an inherited disease, so it's genetic. But stem cells that are supposed to produce white blood cells lack an enzyme that allows them to fight off any infections. And so people with this disorder literally have to live in a sterile environment. All right. Oftentimes they're confined to a small room or even a bed and surrounded by a big plastic bubble that doesn't allow air, normal air, the air in the rest of the home or the hospital to circulate around it. Leukemia is a disorder of the white blood cells. It's essentially a cancer, all right? And in this case, rather than forming tumors, we have white blood cells that are growing out of control. And so you have way too many white blood cells in your bloodstream. And then mononucleosis, also known as the kissing disease, is caused by a virus called the Epstein-Barr virus. And this infects your lymphocytes, and it causes sore throats, a low-grade fever, swollen lymph nodes, and that sort of thing. It's mono is seldom fatal, but it can last for a really long time, months even, because it's your white blood cells that are infected, and it's your white blood cells that are supposed to fight off infection. So if they themselves are infected, it's very difficult to get over a disease like mono. The third and final formed element are the platelets. Now, platelets are not cells, but they are pieces of very large cells called megakaryocytes. And again, they are made by stem cells in the red bone marrow. You make about 200 billion of these bad boys per day. And their job is to function in the clotting of blood. So if you scrape your knee or your elbow, or if you get a bruise, which is internal bleeding, their job is to clot up that problem, right, and stop the bleeding. There are two blood proteins that work with the platelets in order to clot the blood, and those proteins are called thrombin and fibrinogen. And what they do is they build threads called fibrin, which actually help to catch red blood cells. Okay, now how does this actually work? Well, this diagram is kind of neat because it shows what can happen when a blood vessel is damaged. And so up here, you can see a knife or a scissor or something is literally puncturing a blood vessel, a small blood vessel, all right, maybe an arterial or a venule, perhaps even a capillary. And so in the process of clotting your blood, the first thing that happens is that the platelets will actually congregate and form a plug. And you can see the plug right here, which essentially fills up the hole. Now, the platelets themselves, as well as the tissues that have been damaged, the capillary tissues that have been damaged, release an enzyme called prothrombin activator. And you can see that here. And that causes the protein prothrombin to change its structure, change its shape. Remember, the shape and structure of a protein is what gives it its function. And so prothrombin changes into thrombin. And then thrombin causes fibrinogen to form fibrin threads.
It's 11 o'clock.
Thank you, Jesus. These fibrin threads then form a net, which literally traps red blood cells. And this is a photograph of a blood clot. And you can see the fibrin threads there holding the red blood cells in place. Now, eventually those red blood cells will dry out, and that's what forms a scab on your knee or your elbow. All right, so if you cut your skin, for example, that dried up scab on the outside is composed of this. If you were to look at that under a microscope, at least early on in the scabbing process, this is what you would see. Okay. Disorders involving platelets, as every other system, things can go wrong. Some examples are thrombocytopenia, which is a disorder in which the number of platelets is too low in the body because either you're not making enough in the stem cells of the bone marrow, or because they are breaking down too quickly once they get into the bloodstream. A thromboembolism is when a blood clot forms inside the circulatory system, and it breaks off from its original site and plugs up another vessel. And these can be very dangerous because they can lead to heart attacks and strokes and other difficulties. Finally on this list is hemophilia. And hemophilia is a genetic disorder that results in a deficiency of a clotting factor, so that when a person damages a blood vessel, they are unable to properly stop bleeding. The blood doesn't clot, and they can easily bleed to death from wounds or bruising that a normal person would just literally shrug off. Hemophilia ran rampant in the royal family of Europe for many generations, from Queen Victoria onward, although at this point it's probably died out. So, anyway, um, and the genes are no longer being pushed off. So that, my friends, is the end of the first video on blood. We will continue with the second one shortly. And I hope that you learned something.